as important as Hadith is clearly an important historical record and source within Sunni Islam. That goes without say. That said, it is never on the darajah of the Quran, especially and the scholars disagree amongst themselves. They all agree that it's not on the darajah of the Quran, but then they disagree in their attitudes towards it. So Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa, they very early on distinguished between Hadith wa Sunnah. So they said Hadith is simply a historical record, a document. It's a data it's just a document, let's say. Now, Sunnah is the practice. So Imam Malik was very clear, and Imam Abu Hanifa too as well, that every hadith is not a sunnah, and not every sunnah was necessarily documented, although most may be. So it's like a Venn diagram, and you've got that. So a clear example from the Hanafi school where they argue this is the Hanafis will state that, right, the Hanafis will state that Taraweeh was a sunnah to pray it as 20, although, and in Jama'ah, although and this is why Umar radiallahu an did it so. So that's the Hanafi argument. Even if the hadith isn't there, the document isn't there, but we know it was the practice. Otherwise, so this was the argument presented by Imam Abu Hanifa. Otherwise, Umar radiallahu an lam yakun mubtadi'an. He was not somebody to innovate. So that's an example where they are saying that we know this to be the sunnah, but it's not a hadith. And the hadith that we do have, we know not to be the sunnah. So let me give you an example from the Maliki side. The Maliki side, there's many, because Imam Malik had the school of Medina as a practice, and he showed that. So in, let's say, praying with the hands at the side, we call this in the Maliki madhab sadl, right? So you drop the hands at the side. Now, this was the practice of many schools, early schools of Islam within Sunni Islam. So it was the practice of people like Sa'id ibn Musayyab, great tabi'i, the son-in-law of Abu Huraira. It was the practice of Sa'id ibn Jubayr, the student of Ibn Abbas. It was transmitted from Sayyidina Ali radiallahu an. Although it's been challenged, the narration, but let's say the practice. Okay, let's stick to the practices. So you've got Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Sa'id ibn Jubayr, you've got Urwat ibn Zubayr, the nephew of Aisha. You've got Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, it's been transmitted from him. Hasan al-Basri. You've got in addition to that, Layth ibn Sa'ad in Egypt prayed the same way with sadl, hands at the side. The Don of Medina, Imam Malik, prayed with his hands at the side. It's also a transmission in the school of Imam Ahmad. Now, that many people pray with their hands at the side in early Islam. It also happens to be the practice of the Shia in Ja'fari fiqh, going right back, they claim, to Ahlul Bayt, to the Al, the family of the Prophet. It also happens to be the practice of many from a splinter group in early Islam, the Khawarij, who kind of deviate away in very early Islam, but when they prayed, they still prayed with their hands at the side. So when you've got three entirely separate sects in Islam, the Khawarij, who want nothing to do with the other two, Sunni Islam, the main branch, Shia Islam, all of these are entirely separate kind of branches of Islam, yet they all pray with the hands at the side. In Sunni Islam, it was a minority. In early Islam, there were many people, but then it seems to get crushed, because this is in the time of the Tabi'in, the students of the Sahaba, in the time of Bani Umayyah. And there's some theories, I've heard certain scholars present certain theories I know it's also, I've heard Sheikh Hamza Yusuf say as well, who's also Maliki, that this most likely was this practice of sadal, praying with your arms at the side, was suppressed by the regime, Bani Umayyah, because it was the practice of the Shia, the Alun Nabi, so the family of the Prophet, and thereby they didn't want any familiar, I don't know, any kind of commonalities, and thereby they suppressed this practice. I'm not sure how strong that is as an argument, but that's also an argument people have made, because the evidence clearly shows it to be very common in the time of Bani Umayyah. And as following Bani Umayyah, it seems to have become reduced within Sunni Islam. And today it's only alive in the Maliki school, in the school of Medina. And it's a shame that some Malikis nowadays, you see, it doesn't matter how you pray, whether you pray with your hands at the side or you fold them or whatever you do. But it's a shame that you guilt trip people out of things. Because really, as astonishing as this may seem, there isn't a single Sahih Hadith to prove where to place the hands in prayer. There isn't a single Sahih Hadith. The closest Sahih Hadith that they have within Sahih Bukhari has huge problems, because it doesn't mention that the Prophet told them to do it. It mentions Umirna, and then Ismail says, I think he's talking about the Prophet, and some people say maybe he's not talking. And if he hadn't said that, it would have been okay. But the fact he said that showed people were speculating who, because he says we were commanded to place our hands above our hands, Umirna, and it triggered an amount of discussion. Who commanded you? So now the hadith doesn't say it. So people say, well, it must have been the Prophet. But when the narrator in the chain says, I think, he says, La ura illa in yunma dhalika ila nabi. He says, it appears to me that that's going back to the Prophet. Now that shows that there's doubt, because if I have to say that, it creates a discourse. So there is and there's a great Mauritanian scholar, who, the father of Muhammad al-Amin al-Shanqiti, al-Mayabi. Sounds a bit strange for the Desis, Mayabi. Sheikh al-Mayabi, and he has an amazing book, I do have it somewhere, where he brings all the riwayat of holding the hands in prayer and shows every single one is weak or mu'allal, has a problem, and which is another fascinating discussion, because it goes to show that the purpose of prayer could never have been where you place your hands, because otherwise this would have been such an emphasized point, but yet the Prophet ﷺ didn't emphasize it. And that's why one of the transmissions in the Maliki school by Abdul Malik ibn Habib is, if you do fold your arms, فَكَيْفَ مَتَّفَقْ, however they come together. There is no set manner in how to do it. And this is why Ibn Abdul Barr, the great legend of the school of Medina and the master of, a huge Hafid of Hadith, in fact the largest scholar of Hadith in his day and age in the Western world. By Western world we mean west, from Central to West Africa and Spain and Portugal, was Ibn Abdul Barr. And in his book Al-Kafi he states that he says man sadal, he says that you can do sadal or qabd. He says sadal wal qabd kilahuma sunnah, that both are sunnah. And it's interesting, sadal, there is no hadith, or there are, but some weak hadith. So here you have in the school of Medina a clear sunnah, but it doesn't have a hadith. And the hadith is not deemed to be the sunnah. So this is a fascinating discussion. It's always interesting, and it's intriguing how many people are unaware of these discussions, because maybe they haven't read them or they haven't studied them, but these are not hidden discussions. They are very well known in the books of Usul al-Fiqh. Right, so